Hello, and welcome to Story Starters with Dubuque County Library. My name is Miss Kayla, the children's librarian, and today I am going to be reading from Mrs. Frisby and the Rats of NIMH by Robert C. O'Brien. Chapter 1: The Sickness of Timothy Frisby. Mrs. Frisby, the head of a family of field mice, lived in an underground house in the vegetable garden of a farmer named Mr. Fitzgibbon. It was a winter house, such as some field mice move to when food becomes too scarce and the living too hard in the woods and pastures. In the soft earth of a bean, potato, black-eyed pea, and asparagus patch, there is plenty of food left over for mice after the human crop has been gathered. Mrs. Frisby and her family were especially lucky in the house itself. It was a slightly damaged cinder block, the hollow kind with two oval holes through it. It had somehow been abandoned in the garden during the summer and lay almost completely buried, with only a bit of one corner showing above ground, which is how Mrs. Frisby had discovered it. It lay on its side in such a way that the solid parts of the block formed a roof and a floor, both waterproof, and the hollows made two spacious rooms. Lined with bits of leaves, grass, cloth, cotton fluff, feathers, and other soft things Mrs. Frisby and her children had collected, the house stayed dry, warm, and comfortable all winter. A tunnel to the surface earth of the garden, dug so that it was slightly larger than a mouse and slightly smaller than a cat's foreleg, provided access air and even a fair amount of light to the living room. The bedroom, formed by the second oval, was warm but dark, even in midday. A short tunnel through the earth behind the block connected the two rooms. Although she was a widow, her husband had died only the preceding summer. Mrs. Frisby was able, through luck and hard work, to keep her family. There were 4 children, happy and fed. January and February were the hardest months. The sharp, hard cold that began in December lasted until March, and by February the beans and black eyes had been picked over, with help from the birds, and asparagus roots were frozen into stone, and the potatoes had been thawed and refrozen so many times that they had acquired a slimy texture and a rancid taste. Still, the Frisbys made the best of what there was, and one way or another they kept from being hungry. Then, one day at the very end of February, Mrs. Frisby's younger son, Timothy, fell sick. That day began with a dry, bright, icy morning. Mrs. Frisby woke up early, as she always did. She and her family slept close together in a bed of down, fluff, and bits of cloth they had gathered, warm as a ball of fur. She stood up carefully so as not to awaken the children, and walked quickly through the short tunnel to the living room. Here it was not so warm, but not really cold either. She could see from the light filtering down the entrance tunnel that the sun was up and bright. She looked at the food in her pantry, a hollowed-out space lined with small stones in the earth behind the living room. There was plenty of food for breakfast, and lunch, and dinner too, for that matter. But still the sight depressed her, for it was the same tiresome fare they had been eating every day, every meal, for the last month. She wished she knew where she could find a bit of green lettuce, or a small egg, or a taste of cheese, or a corn muffin. There were eggs in plenty not far off in the hen house, but hens and hens' eggs are too big for a field mouse to cope with, and besides, between the garden and the hen house there was a large, wide sward of shrubs and grass, some of it grown up quite tall. Cat territory. She climbed up the tunnel, emerging whiskers first, and looked around warily. The air was sharp, and there was white frost thick on the ground and on the dead leaves at the edge of the woods across the garden patch. Mrs. Frisby set off over the gently furrowed earth, and when she reached the fence, she turned right, skirting the border of the forest, searching with her bright round eyes for a bit of carrot, a frozen parsnip, or something green. But there was nothing green at that time of year, but the needles on the pine tree and the leaves on the holly, neither of which a mouse, or any other animal for that matter, can eat. And then, straight in front of her, she did see something green. She had reached the far corner of the garden, and there, at the edge of the woods where it met the fence, was a stump. In the stump there was a hole, and out of the hole protruded something that looked a little like a leaf, but was not. Mrs. Frisby had no trouble at all going through the cattle wire fence. She approached the hole cautiously. If the stump was hollow, as it seemed to be, there was no telling who or what might be living in it. A foot or so from the hole she stopped, stood still, and watched and listened. She could hear no sound, but from there she could see what the green was. It was, in fact, a yellowish-brownish green, a bit of a corn shuck. But what was a corn shuck doing there? The cornfield was in a different part of the farm altogether, away beyond the pasture. Mrs. Frisby hopped closer and then, carefully, crept up the side of the stump and peered inside. When her eyes got used to the dark, she saw that she had found a treasure, a winter's supply of food carefully stored, and then, for some reason, forgotten and abandoned. But stored by whom? A raccoon, perhaps? Not very likely, so far from the stream. More likely a squirrel or groundhog. She knew that both of these felt free to help themselves to the new corn each year, and that they were strong enough to carry ears away and store them. But whoever had done it, why had he then abandoned the store? And then she remembered. Back in November, there had come from near that edge of the woods the sound that sends all the animals in the forest shivering to their hiding places, the sound of hunters' guns shooting, the sound that is accompanied, for someone, by a fiery, stabbing pain. And then he never needs stored food again. Still, since Mrs. Frisby did not even know what kind of animal it had been, much less his name, she could not shed many tears over him. And food was food. It was not the green lettuce she had longed for, but she and her children were extremely fond of corn, and there were 8 large ears in the stump, a noble supply for a mouse family. Down under the corn she could also see a pile of fresh peanuts. From still another part of the farm, some hickory nuts, and a stack of dried, sweet-smelling mushrooms. With her forepaws and sharp teeth, she pulled off a part of the husk from the top ear of corn and folded it double to serve as a crude carrying bag. Then she pulled loose as many of the yellow kernels as she could easily lift, and putting them in the shuck bag, she hopped off briskly for home. She would come back for more after breakfast and bring the children to help. She backed down the tunnel entrance to her house tail first, pulling the corn after her and calling cheerfully as she went. "Children, wake up! See what I have for breakfast! A surprise!" They came hurrying out, rubbing their eyes in excitement, for any kind of surprise in food was a rare and festive thing in the cold dead of winter. Teresa, the oldest, came first. Crowding close behind her was Martin, the biggest, a strong, quick mouse, dark-haired and handsome like his poor father. Then came Cynthia, the youngest, a slim, pretty girl mouse, light-haired and, in fact, a little light-headed as well, and over-fond of dancing. "Where is it?" she said. "Where is it? What is it? Where's the surprise?" "Where is Timothy?" asked Mrs. Frisby. "Mother," said Teresa, concerned, "he says he's sick and he can't get up." "Nonsense. Martin, tell your brother to get out of bed at once or he'll get no breakfast." Martin ran to the bedroom obediently, but came back in a moment alone. "He says he's too sick and he doesn't want any breakfast, even a surprise. I felt his forehead and it's burning hot." "Oh dear," said Mrs. Frisby. That sounds as if he really is sick. Timothy had, on occasion, been known to think he was sick when he really was not. Here you may all have breakfast, save Timothy's, and I'll go and see what's wrong. She opened up the green carrying bag and put the corn on the table, dividing it into 5 equal shares. The dining table was a smooth piece of lath supported on both ends by stones. Corn! Shouted Martin. Oh, mother, wherever did you get it? Eat up, said Mrs. Frisby, and a little later I'll show you, because there's a lot more where this came from. And she disappeared into the little hallway that led to the bedroom. A lot more, Martin repeated as he sat down with his 2 sisters. That sounds like enough to last till moving day. I hope so, Cynthia said. When is moving day anyway? 2 weeks, said Martin with authority. Maybe 3. Oh, Martin, how do you know? Protested Teresa. What if it stays cold? Anyway, suppose Timothy isn't well enough. At this dreadful thought, so casually raised, they all grew worried and fell silent. Then Cynthia said, Teresa, you shouldn't be all gloomy. Of course he'll be well. It's just a cold, that's all. She finished eating her corn, and so did the others. In the bedroom, Mrs. Frisby felt Timothy's forehead. It was indeed hot and damp with sweat. She took his pulse and dropped his wrist in alarm at what she felt. Do you feel sick in your stomach? No, Mother. I feel all right, only cold. When I get up, I feel dizzy. I can't get my breath too well. Mrs. Frisby peered anxiously at his face, and would have looked at his tongue, but in the dark room she could see no more than the dim outline of his head. He was the thinnest of her children, and had a dark complexion like his father and brother. He was narrow of face, his eyes were unusually large and bright, and shone with the intensity of his thought when he spoke. He was, Mrs. Frisby knew, the smartest and most thoughtful of her children, though she would never have admitted this out loud. But he was also the frailest, and when colds or flu or virus infections came around, he was the first to catch them and the slowest to recover. There was no doubt that he was really sick this time. His head felt as if he had a high fever, and his pulse was very fast. Poor Timothy! Lie back down and keep covered. She spread over him some of the bits of cloth they used as blankets. After a while, we'll fix you a pallet in the living room so you can lie out there where it's more light. I've found a fine supply of corn this morning, more than we can eat for the rest of the winter. Would you like some? No, thank you. I'm not hungry. Not now. He closed his eyes, and in a few minutes he went to sleep. But it was a restless sleep, in which he tossed and moaned continuously. In mid-morning, Mrs. Frisby, Martin, and Cynthia set off for the stump to carry home some more of the corn and some peanuts and mushrooms. The hickory nuts they would leave, for they were too hard for mouse jaws to crack and too tedious to gnaw through. They left Teresa home to look after Timothy, whom they had wrapped up and helped into a temporary sickbed in the living room. When they returned at lunchtime, carrying heavy loads of food, they found her near tears from worry. Timothy was much worse. His eyes looked wild and strange from the fever. He trembled continuously, and each breath he took sounded like a gasp for life. Teresa said, Oh, Mother, I'm so glad you're back. He's been having nightmares and shouting about monsters and cats, and when I talk to him, he doesn't hear me at all. Not only was Timothy not hearing with his ears, his eyes, though wide open, were not seeing, or if they were, he was not recognizing what he saw. When his mother tried to talk to him, to hold his hand and ask him how he felt, he stared past her as if she did not exist. Then he gave out a long, low moan and seemed to be trying to say something, but the words would not form properly and made no sense at all. The other children stared in frightened silence. Finally, Martin asked, Mother, what is it? What's wrong with him? He's terribly ill. His fever is so high he's become delirious. There's nothing for it. I will have to go and see Mr. Ages. Timothy must have medicine. Chapter 2. Mr. Ages. Mr. Ages was a white mouse who lived across the farm and beyond, in a house that was part of a brick wall. The wall lined the basement of what had once been a large farmhouse. The farmhouse itself had burned down so many years ago that nobody could remember what it looked like, nor who had lived there. The basement remained, a great square hole in the ground, and in its crumbling walls, protected from the wind and snow, numerous small creatures lived. In summer there were snakes, dangerous to Mrs. Frisby, but there was no need to worry about them in winter. Just the same, it was a long, hard journey, and could be risky unless she was extremely cautious. It was so far, in fact, that Mrs. Frisby would not ordinarily have set out so late in the day, for fear that the dark would catch her before she got back. But Timothy obviously could not wait until the next day, so only 5 minutes after she had announced that she must go, she was gone. If she had been able to follow her nose, that is, to take the shortest route to where Mr. Ages lived, her journey would have been easy enough. But since that would have led her close to the farmhouse and the barn, and since the cat stalked those grounds relentlessly, she had to plot a much more roundabout way, circling the whole wide farmyard and sticking to the fringe of the woods. She loped along briskly, moving in the easy horse-like canter mice use when they are trying to cover ground. Her progress was almost completely noiseless. She chose her path where the earth was bare, or where grass grew, and she avoided dead leaves, which would rustle and crackle, even under her small weight. Always she kept an eye out for hiding places, logs, roots, stones, things to scurry under if she should meet a larger animal who might be unfriendly. For though the cat was number one, there were other things in the woods that chased mice. And she did all this, and as she did all this, she worried about Timothy and hoped that Mr. Ages would know something that would help him. It was more than 2 hours later that she saw she was getting close to the brick wall where he lived. Though her husband had been a great friend of Mr. Ages and had visited him often, Mrs. Frisby found Mrs. Frisby herself had been there only once before, and that had been in summer. Still, she remembered the place clearly. It was an odd sort of clearing in the woods. Long ago, when the old house had been lived in, before it had burned, there must have been a wide lawn around it. Over the years, this clearing had grown over with a strange mixture of high-rank grass, tall weeds, berries, and wildflowers. In the summer, it was a wild and beautiful place, bright with blooms and full of the smell of blackberry blossoms and purple clover. There were harsher plants as well, spiked jimson weeds and poisonous dark pokeberries, and bees droning everywhere. But in winter it had a bleak and almost ghostly look, for the blossoms and the green leaves were gone, and only the dry skeletons of the weeds stood, hung with stalks and seeds and pods that rattled in the wind. It was from these seeds, and others, and from the flowers and roots beneath them, that Mr. Ages made the draughts and powders that could sometimes save the sick from dying. The time she had been here before, that was for Timothy, too, when he was only a baby, scarcely bigger than a marble. He had wandered, while playing with the other children, a little way from them and had been bitten or stung by something poisonous. They did not know what. When they found him, he lay curled in a ball, paralyzed and scarcely able to breathe. That time, her husband, Mr. Frisby, had been alive, and between them taking turns, they had managed to carry Timothy to Mr. Ages' house. It was a sad and frightening journey, and when they arrived, they had been afraid he might already be dead. Mr. Ages looked at him, examined his tongue, felt his pulse, and found a bright red lump near his neck. "Spider," he said. "Not a black widow, but bad enough." He had forced a few drops of a milky liquid into Timothy's mouth and held him upright so that it could trickle down his throat, for Timothy could not swallow. In a few minutes his small muscles had unlocked, and he was able to move his arms and legs. "He'll be all right," said Mr. Ages, "but weak for a few hours." The trip back home had been a happy one, and the other children were wide-eyed with joy to see Timothy alive. Yet Mrs. Frisby thought that this might have been the beginning of his frailness. From that time on he tended to stumble a little when he walked, especially when he was tired. He never grew as big or as vigorous as his brother Martin, but he thought a great deal more, and in that he resembled his father. Now she reached Mr. Ages' house, a hole in the brick wall where one end of the heavy floor beam had once rested. It was about 2 feet below the top of the wall, and one reached it by climbing down a sort of rough stairway of broken brick ends. She knocked on his door, made of a piece of shingle. "Oh, let him be in, please," she thought, but he was not. There was no answer, so she sat down to wait on the narrow ledge of a brick in front of his door. Half an hour passed, the sun sinking lower in the west all the time, before she heard a slight scratching noise up above, and there he came, carrying a cloth sack bulging with some kind of lumpy material. His fur was a soft gray-white, and so glossy it seemed to almost glow. Mrs. Frisby had heard that Mr. Ages was not truly a white mouse. That is, he had not been born with white fur, but had turned white from old age. Whether this was so or not, she did not know. Certainly he seemed very old and very wise, yet he walked nimbly enough. "Oh, Mr. Ages, I'm so glad you've come," she said. "I don't suppose you remember me. Mrs. Frisby." "Oh, of course I remember you, and I was sad to hear about poor Mr. Frisby. How was your young son? Timothy, was it?" "It's about him I've come to see you. He's taken terribly sick." "Oh, has he? I was afraid he might turn out to not be as strong as the others." "I hoped you might be able to help him." "Maybe. Come in, please, so I can put down this sack." Mr. Ages' house, somewhat larger than a shoebox, but almost the same shape, resembled the house of a hermit. It was bare of furniture, except for a bit of bedding in one corner, a stool made of a piece of brick, and another piece of brick worn smooth from use as a pestle, on which he ground out his medicines. Along one entire wall, arranged neatly in small piles, stood the raw materials he had collected: roots, seeds, dried leaves, pods, strips of bark, and shriveled mushrooms. To this row he now added the contents of his sack. It held a number of small plants, all of them the same kind, with stringy roots and dark-veined green leaves that looked like mint. Pipsissewa, Pipsissewa, said Mr. Ages. But botanically, Chimaphila umbellata. It stays green all winter and makes a very useful spring tonic. Most people only use the leaves, but I've found the roots even more effective." He arranged the plants in an orderly pile. "But that's not what you're here for. What's wrong with young Timothy?" "He has a very high fever. He's delirious. I don't know what to do." "How high?" "So high he feels burning hot to the touch, runs with perspiration, and yet he shivers with cold at the same time." "Keep him wrapped up in a blanket." "I do."
"And his pulse?"
"So fast you can hardly tell one heartbeat from the next."
"His tongue?"
"So coated it looks purple."
"How does he breathe?"
"He breathes very rapidly, and the air rasps in his chest He said at first that he could not get his breath.
But he does not cough.
No.
He has pneumonia, said Mr. Ages. I have some medicine that will help him. But the most important thing is to keep him warm, and he must stay in bed.
He went to the back of his house, and from a ledge formed by a projecting brick, he took 3 packets of medicine, powders neatly wrapped in white paper.
Give him one of these tonight. Mix it in water and make him drink it. If he is still delirious, hold his nose and pour it down his throat. Give him the second one tomorrow morning and the third the next morning.
Mrs. Frisby took the packages. Will he get better? She asked, dreading to hear the answer.
He will get better this time. His fever will be less on the second day and gone the third, after he has taken all the medicine. That does not mean he will have recovered. His lungs will still be terribly weak and sensitive. If he gets the least bit cold or breathes cold air, even a breath or two, the pneumonia will surely come back worse than before, and the second time he may not recover. This will be true for at least 3 weeks, and more likely a month.
And after that?
Even after that, he should be careful, though we may hope by then the weather will be warmer.
By now the sun was getting low in the west, settling into the high mountains beyond the woods. Mrs. Frisby thanked Mr. Ages and set out for home as quickly as she could go. I will stop there. So that was the first 2 chapters of Mrs. Frisby and the Rats of NIMH. If you'd like to finish the book on your own, we do have it at the library, so you can head over here and check it out. So thanks for joining me. Next week, we'll be back with another book. Bye.